Among all these women, you are the one I have chosen. You will be mine." The voice of Alpha King Darius Stormfang echoed through the hall like thunder, silencing 256 candidates who had traveled from every corner of the realm. Women of noble lineage, dressed in silks and jewels, their faces painted with the hope of becoming Luna. But the king's icy eyes were not upon them. They were fixed on a servant. Ariel froze, still holding the torn dress she had been mending in the forgotten corner of the hall. Her faded blue uniform contrasted brutally with the splendor surrounding her. Her red hair fell disheveled over her shoulders. She was nobody. A poor Omega, daughter of nothing, invisible to the world. Until that moment. "Your Majesty, there must be some mistake," she whispered, her voice trembling as he approached, each step deliberate, each movement charged with an intention that made her heart race. "There is no mistake," Darius said, his voice low and rough, meant only for her. His gray eyes pierced through her, as if they could read every secret buried in her soul. "I spent the entire evening searching for something I couldn't name. And then I saw you, hidden in the shadows where you thought you belonged. But you were wrong, Ariel. You don't belong in the shadows. You belong at my side." Screams of indignation erupted through the hall. Tears from rejected candidates, protests from outraged nobles. But none of it mattered. Because in that instant, under the gaze of hundreds of shocked witnesses, the most powerful man in the realm extended his hand to a servant and changed both their destinies forever. But what no one knew was that this choice would unleash consequences none of them could predict. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are. I hope you enjoy the story. The candles flickered like dying stars in the grand hall of Stormfang Castle, casting shadows that danced across 256 faces painted with hope and desperation. Each woman wore silk and jewels that caught the light, their beauty carefully constructed, their smiles rehearsed to perfection. They had come from every corner of the realm, summoned by a decree that had set hearts aflame and ambitions soaring. The Alpha King needed a Luna, and tonight, beneath the vaulted ceiling where ancient banners hung like ghosts of forgotten wars, one of them would be chosen. But Alpha King Darius Stormfang stood at the head of the hall with eyes as cold as winter frost, and in those eyes, there was nothing but emptiness. His white hair gleamed like freshly fallen snow under the chandelier's glow, cut short and severe, framing a face carved from stone and shadow. No beard softened the sharp line of his jaw. No warmth touched his features. He was a monument to power, to duty, to a throne built on the bones of enemies and the weight of centuries. At 32, he had conquered kingdoms, crushed rebellions, and earned the fear of every wolf who dared speak his name. But standing here, surrounded by feminine laughter and perfume thick as fog, he felt nothing. The ceremony had begun at sunset. One by one, the candidates approached the dais where he sat, each offering words honeyed with flattery, eyes bright with calculated charm. They spoke of bloodlines and alliances, of beauty and grace, of everything except what he truly sought. He didn't even know what that was anymore. Perhaps nothing existed that could fill the hollow space inside his chest, that echoing chamber where a heart should beat with something other than obligation. By the 200th woman, Darius could barely distinguish one face from another. They blurred together like watercolors in rain, all practiced smiles and empty promises. His advisors watched from the shadows, their anxiety palpable. The kingdom needed a Luna. The pack required an heir. Everything depended on this choice. And yet every fiber of his being screamed that none of these women belonged at his side. "Your Majesty," the master of ceremonies whispered, leaning close. "Perhaps you should take a brief respite. There are still many candidates remaining." Darius waved him away with barely concealed irritation. The air in the hall had grown thick and suffocating, heavy with expectations he could not meet. He stood abruptly, the scrape of his chair against marble echoing like thunder through the suddenly silent room. 256 pairs of eyes turned to him, some hopeful, some anxious, all desperate. "Continue," he commanded, his voice low and rough as gravel. "I will observe from there." He descended from the dais and moved along the perimeter of the hall, his presence parting the crowd like a blade through water. The candidates resumed their nervous chatter, stealing glances at him, adjusting their gowns, touching their hair with trembling fingers. None of it touched him. None of it mattered. And then he saw her. She was not among the candidates. She existed in the margins of the ceremony, in the forgotten spaces between grandeur and servitude. In a small alcove near the eastern wall, surrounded by discarded gowns and abandoned accessories, a young woman knelt on the stone floor, her fingers working quickly to repair a torn hem. She wore a simple blue servant's dress, worn thin at the elbows, the color faded from too many washings. Her red hair fell in waves down her back, catching the candlelight and transforming it into living flame. Darius stopped walking. His breath caught in his throat, an unfamiliar sensation that bordered on pain. The noise of the hall faded to a distant murmur, as if the world itself had contracted to this single moment, this single vision of a woman who knelt in shadows and stitched torn silk with careful hands. She had not noticed him. Her attention remained fixed on her work, her expression serene with concentration. There was something in the way she held herself, a quiet dignity that no amount of poverty could diminish, a grace that had nothing to do with practiced movements or calculated charm. She was simply herself, unaware of her beauty, unconscious of the way the candlelight loved her hair, her skin, the delicate curve of her neck. "Who is she?" Darius heard himself ask, his voice strange in his own ears. A servant materialized at his elbow, bowing low. "That is Ariel, Your Majesty." One of the seamstresses brought in to assist with the candidates' preparations. "Ariel," he repeated, and the name tasted like hope on his tongue. The servant shifted uncomfortably. "She is no one, Your Majesty. An Omega, the daughter of servants. She has no family, no status, no. Bring her to me." The servant's eyes widened. "Your Majesty, I don't think. Now." The command cracked through the air like a whip. The servant scurried away, and Darius watched as he approached the alcove, watched as Ariel looked up in confusion, watched as the color drained from her face when the servant pointed in his direction. She rose to her feet slowly, her hands still holding the gown she had been mending, her eyes wide with something that looked like fear. But underneath that fear, Darius saw something else. A spark. A light that all the candidates' artificial brightness could not match. She approached him with reluctant steps, her head bowed, her fingers twisting the fabric she carried. When she stood before him, he could smell her scent beneath the dust and candle wax. Something wild and clean, like rain on mountain stones, like pine forests after a storm. "Look at me," he said softly. She raised her eyes, and the world tilted on its axis. Her eyes were the color of amber, flecked with gold, and in them he saw forests deep and ancient, saw loneliness that mirrored his own, saw a soul that had known suffering and somehow remained unbroken. Recognition slammed into him like a physical force, stealing his breath, stopping his heart. This was what he had been searching for. This woman who knelt in shadows and made torn things whole. "What is your name?" he asked, though he already knew. "Ariel, Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice soft as falling leaves. "And you are Omega." It was not a question, but she nodded anyway, her expression cautious. Around them, the hall had fallen silent. 256 candidates watched with growing horror as their Alpha King stood transfixed before a servant girl in a faded blue dress. Darius reached out slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wished. She did not. His fingers touched her chin, tilting her face up to catch the light. Up close, he could see the faint freckles scattered across her nose, the slight tremble of her lips, the rapid pulse beating at the hollow of her throat. She was terrified, he realized, but she did not run. She stood before him with a courage that made his chest ache. "Do you know why you are here tonight?" he asked. "To serve, Your Majesty." "No." He stepped closer, and her scent wrapped around him like a benediction. "You are here because fate has a cruel sense of humor, because I have spent this entire evening searching for something I could not name, and you were here all along, hiding in the shadows where you thought you belonged." Confusion flickered across her face. "I don't understand." "You will." He turned to address the hall, his voice carrying to every corner, every shocked face. "The ceremony is concluded. I have made my choice." Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. The master of ceremonies hurried forward, his face pale with panic. "Your Majesty, surely you cannot mean—" "Ariel will be my Luna." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of disbelief and outrage through the assembled nobles and candidates. Someone screamed. Someone else began to cry. But Darius heard none of it. He saw only Ariel's face, the shock and fear, and something else. Something that might have been a desperate, barely acknowledged hope. "Your Majesty," she breathed. "I cannot. I am no one. I have nothing to offer you. You have everything," he interrupted, and he meant it with a certainty that terrified him. "Everything I have been searching for without knowing it. Will you accept?" She stared at him for a long moment. This powerful man who commanded armies and ruled nations, who now stood before her with his heart in his hands and his future in her answer. Tears gathered in her amber eyes, catching the candlelight like captured stars. "Yes," she whispered finally, the word barely audible. "Yes, I will." And in that moment, in that ancient hall filled with the ghosts of kings and the dreams of disappointed women, something fundamental shifted in the fabric of the world. Darius Stormfang took the hand of a servant girl with red hair and amber eyes, and felt, for the first time in his life, that he had come home. The chaos that erupted in the wake of his declaration was immediate and absolute. Candidates wept and wailed, their carefully constructed hopes crumbling like sand castles before the tide. Noble families protested, their voices rising in indignation. How could the Alpha King choose a nobody, an Omega with no bloodline, no wealth, no political advantage? It was madness, they cried. It was an insult to every woman of breeding who had presented herself for his consideration. But Darius heard none of it. He led Ariel through the tumult, his hand firm around hers, his body a shield between her and the anger that swirled like a storm. They climbed the curved stairs to the eastern tower, leaving behind the chaos and confusion, ascending into silence and starlight. When they reached his private chambers, he finally released her hand and stepped back, giving her space to breathe. "I know this must be overwhelming," he said quietly, watching as she turned slowly, taking in the opulence that surrounded her. Heavy curtains framed windows that looked out over the moonlit kingdom. A fire burned low in the hearth. Books lined the walls, and maps covered the massive desk in the corner. It was a room made for power, for lonely nights spent making decisions that would affect thousands. Ariel moved to the window, her fingers trailing along the stone sill. "Why?" she asked, her voice small in the vast space. "Why me?" "I wish I could explain it in a way that would make sense," Darius replied, coming to stand beside her. "I have spent years believing I was incapable of connection. I built walls around my heart and told myself it was necessary, that kings could not afford weakness, that emotion was a luxury I could not indulge. Tonight, I met 256 women, each one beautiful and accomplished and suitable. And I felt nothing." He paused, searching for words that seemed inadequate to the enormity of what he felt. Then I saw you in the shadows, mending a torn dress, and something inside me recognized something inside you. A kinship of solitude, a shared understanding of what it means to exist on the margins of things, looking in at a world that was never meant for us. Ariel turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You are a king," she whispered. "You belong to this world in ways I never could." "I am nothing, Your Majesty. I have spent my entire life being nothing." "Then let me tell you who you are," he said, reaching up to wipe away her tears with gentle fingers. "You are the woman who will stand beside me when the weight of the crown becomes too heavy to bear. You are the light that will chase away the shadows in my soul. You are the home I have spent my entire life searching for without knowing what I sought." "You don't know me," she protested weakly. "No," he agreed, "but I want to. I want to know every story written in your eyes, every scar hidden beneath your skin. I want to understand what shaped you, what broke you, what made you into someone who could kneel in shadows and still shine like the sun." She looked at him for a long moment, this powerful man who spoke of darkness and light, of recognition and belonging. Then she turned back to the window, gazing out at the kingdom spread below them like a tapestry of stars and shadows. "You want to know my story?" she asked quietly. "It is not a happy one." "Neither is mine," he replied. "Perhaps that is why we are meant to share them." Ariel was quiet for a long time, her silhouette stark against the moonlight streaming through the window. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and distant, as if she were pulling memories from a deep well, each one heavy with the weight of years. "I was born in a village called Thornwood, in the shadow of the Blackpine Mountains," she began. "My mother was a seamstress, my father a carpenter. They were good people, kind people, but we were poor. So poor that hunger was a constant companion, as familiar as our own shadows." She wrapped her arms around herself, though the room was warm. "I was their only child, born late in their lives, when they had long given up hope of having children. My mother used to say I was a miracle, a gift from the moon goddess herself. She would stroke my hair and sing to me songs about brave wolves and true love, about destiny and belonging." Darius remained silent, letting her words flow, knowing that some stories needed to be told without interruption, like rivers that must reach the sea. "When I was 7 years old, a sickness came to Thornwood. It spread through the village like wildfire, taking the old and the young, the strong and the weak. My father fell first. I remember him lying in bed, his body burning with fever, his eyes glassy and unfocused. My mother stayed by his side day and night, trying every remedy she knew, praying to every god who might listen. Her voice cracked, but she continued. He died on the 3rd day of the illness. We buried him in the village graveyard, under a twisted pine tree. I was too young to understand permanence, too innocent to grasp that gone meant forever. I kept asking when he would come home, and my mother would cry and hold me, and not answer. Darius felt his chest constrict with empathy. He wanted to reach for her, to offer comfort, but something told him she needed to finish this, needed to speak these words into the world before they could begin to heal. 2 weeks later, my mother fell ill with the same sickness. This time, I understood what it meant. I sat beside her bed and held her hand and begged her not to leave me. She was so weak by then, so thin. Her beautiful auburn hair, the same color as mine, lay dull and lifeless on the pillow. But she smiled at me, even through the pain, and told me I was strong, that I would survive, that I had to survive. Ariel's hands clenched into fists. She died holding my hand. I was 7 years old, and suddenly I was alone in the world. An orphan. An Omega with no family, no protection, no value. The village elders tried to find someone to take me in, but no one wanted another mouth to feed, especially not an Omega child who might present problems later. So they sent me to the capital, to the servants' house, a place where orphans were trained for domestic service. I was told I was lucky to have a place to go, that many children in my situation ended up on the streets or worse. She laughed bitterly. The servants' house was a stone building on the edge of the city, cold and gray and filled with children just like me. Children with hollow eyes and empty bellies. Children who had learned too young that the world was not kind, that survival meant making yourself small and invisible and useful. We were taught to sew, to clean, to cook, to serve. We were beaten when we made mistakes, praised when we pleased our instructors. I learned quickly that obedience was safety, that the less attention you drew to yourself, the better. I learned to move through rooms like a ghost, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to make myself so useful that they would keep me, feed me, give me a corner to sleep in. Darius's jaw clenched. The thought of her as a child, small and afraid and alone, filled him with a rage that had no target, no enemy to strike down. He wanted to go back in time and gather that frightened girl into his arms, to tell her that she mattered, that she was worth more than her usefulness. I spent 10 years in that house, Ariel continued. 10 years learning how to be invisible, how to serve, how to expect nothing from life except the opportunity to keep existing. The other servants became my family, but even among them, I was different. As I grew older and presented as Omega, the gap between us widened. Betas and Alphas at least had the possibility of rising above their station, of marrying well or earning freedom. But Omegas, she shook her head. We were meant to serve, to submit, to accept our place at the bottom of the hierarchy. When I turned 17, I was assigned to the castle as one of the seamstress's assistants. It was considered a prestigious position, a sign that I had learned my lessons well. And it was better than the alternative, being sold to a lesser house or given to an Alpha who wanted an Omega servant for less reputable purposes. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. So I came here, to this castle, to these halls of marble and gold. And I did what I had always done. I made myself useful. I kept my head down. I stitched and mended and cleaned. And I told myself that this was enough, that I should be grateful for a warm bed and regular meals and work that kept my hands busy. She turned to face Darius, her amber eyes shining with unshed tears. I never let myself dream of anything more. Dreams were dangerous. Dreams were for women with families and futures, not for orphaned Omegas who existed in the margins of society. So I locked my heart away in a box buried deep, and I told myself I was content, that this half-life was all I deserved. Until tonight, she whispered. Until you looked at me like I was someone worth seeing. And now all those buried dreams are clawing their way out. And I am so afraid, Your Majesty. I am so terrified of hoping for something I was never meant to have. Darius moved then, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that spilled down her cheeks. You deserve everything, he said fiercely. Everything that was taken from you. Everything you were told you could not have. You deserve love and safety, and a place in this world where you are cherished for who you are, not what you can provide. I am going to spend the rest of my life proving that to you, he continued, his voice rough with emotion. I am going to show you that you are not invisible, that you matter, that your existence makes this world brighter. And I am going to hunt down every person who ever made you feel less than the extraordinary woman you are, and I am going to make them regret it. A sob broke from her throat, and then she was in his arms, clinging to him as years of suppressed grief and loneliness poured out in racking cries. He held her through it, his hand stroking her hair, his voice murmuring comfort, his heart breaking and mending with every shuddering breath she took. They stood like that for a long time. Two souls who had spent their lives in isolation finally finding shelter in each other. When her tears finally subsided, Ariel pulled back slightly, looking up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "I don't know how to be a Luna," she admitted. "I don't know how to be anything except what I have always been." "Then we will learn together," Darius replied, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I don't know how to be a partner, how to share this burden I have carried alone. But I want to try. With you, I want to try." She nodded slowly, a tentative smile breaking through the tears, like sunlight through storm clouds. For the first time in her life, Ariel allowed herself to hope. It was a fragile thing, this hope, as delicate as spider silk. But it was there, growing stronger with every moment she spent in his arms. They stood together at the window, watching the moon trace its path across the sky, and neither of them noticed the shadow that moved in the corridor outside, or the hatred burning in eyes that watched them through a crack in the door. The days that followed were a whirlwind of ceremony and preparation. The entire kingdom buzzed with gossip about the Alpha King's shocking choice, speculation running rampant through every tavern and market. Some whispered that he had lost his mind, that the stress of ruling had finally broken him. Others claimed it was a political move so brilliant that only time would reveal its genius. But most simply talked about the servant girl with red hair who had somehow captured the heart of the most powerful alpha in the realm. Ariel moved through it all in a state of disbelief, feeling like a character in one of her mother's old stories. She was fitted for gowns of silk and velvet, taught the intricate dances of courtly life, instructed in protocol and etiquette by stern-faced advisors who could barely hide their disapproval. Every moment felt surreal, like she was wearing someone else's skin, playing a role she had not auditioned for. But through it all, Darius remained her anchor. He attended the lessons when he could, his presence a silent support that gave her strength. In the evenings, they would retreat to his chambers, away from the scrutiny and judgment, and simply talk. He told her about his childhood, about the weight of expectations that had been placed on his shoulders before he could walk, about the loneliness of power and the isolation of the throne. "My father was a hard man," he said one night, as they sat before the fire. "Strong and capable, but without warmth. He raised me to be a weapon, a tool for preserving his legacy. Emotions were weakness. Compassion was vulnerability. Love was a distraction that could get you killed." He stared into the flames, his profile cast in gold and shadow. "I learned those lessons well. Too well. By the time I took the throne after his death, I had become exactly what he wanted. A king without a heart. A ruler who could make the hard choices without flinching. And for years, I told myself that was enough. That this was what I was meant to be." "But it wasn't," Ariel said softly, reaching for his hand. "You're not just a weapon or a tool. You're a man who deserves happiness, who deserves to live for something more than duty." He turned to look at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes made her breath catch. "You see that in me? Even after everything I've done, all the hardness I've cultivated, I see the man who knelt beside me and wiped away my tears," she replied. "The man who listens to my stories and treats me like I matter. That is who you really are, Darius. Everything else is just armor you wore to survive." He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "You undo me," he whispered. "You make me want things I thought I had killed long ago. Hope, connection, a future that isn't just an endless march of duty and obligation." "Then let yourself want them," she murmured. "Let yourself believe that we can have this, that we deserve this." They held each other in the firelight, two broken souls learning how to be whole. And outside the window, spring began to paint the kingdom in shades of green and gold. The Luna ceremony was scheduled for the first full moon of the new season, 2 weeks after the choosing. The entire court buzzed with preparation. servants rushing through the halls with flowers and fabric, cooks laboring over elaborate feasts, musicians practicing songs of celebration and blessing. It should have been a time of joy, but Ariel could feel the undercurrent of resentment flowing through the castle like a poisoned river. Many of the nobles had not forgiven Darius for his choice. They saw Ariel as an interloper, an Omega who had somehow bewitched their king into making a foolish decision. Whispers followed her through the corridors, words meant to be overheard, designed to cut and wound. Gold digger, social climber, manipulator. Each one landed like a blow, reopening wounds she had thought healed. But she endured. For Darius, she endured. He believed in her, saw value in her, and she would not let him down, would not prove his detractors right by crumbling under the pressure. She held her head high, spoke graciously to those who sneered at her, and tried to ignore the way her hands shook when she was alone. 3 days before the ceremony, she was in the gardens, seeking a moment of peace among the roses, when she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to find a woman standing on the path, tall and elegant, with dark hair piled high and eyes like chips of ice. Ariel recognized her immediately as Lady Morgana, one of the candidates from the choosing, daughter of one of the most powerful noble families in the realm. "So this is where the little Omega hides," Morgana said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Away from the court that whispers about your unsuitability, from the nobles who know you are nothing but a mistake that will be corrected in time." Ariel's heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. "Good afternoon, Lady Morgana. I apologize if my presence in the garden disturbs you. I can leave if you—" "Don't play the submissive servant with me," Morgana interrupted, stepping closer. "We both know what you are. A nobody who got lucky, who somehow caught the king's eye during a moment of weakness. But luck runs out, little Omega. And when it does, you will find yourself back in the servants' quarters where you belong." "I don't know what you want me to say," Ariel replied quietly. "I didn't seek this. I didn't plan or scheme or manipulate. I was simply in the right place at the right time, and the king chose me. If you have grievances about that choice, perhaps you should take them up with His Majesty." Morgana laughed, a sharp sound like breaking glass. "Oh, I intend to. Because you see, I know something you don't. I know that a king's fascination is a fleeting thing, especially when based on nothing more than a pretty face and the appeal of slumming with a servant. Once the novelty wears off, once reality sets in, he will see his mistake. And when that happens, someone suitable will need to be ready to step in and clean up this mess." She leaned in close, her breath hot against Ariel's ear. "Enjoy your moment in the sun, little Omega, because winter is coming, and you have no idea how cold it can get in this castle." She swept away, leaving Ariel standing alone among the roses, trembling with a fear that had nothing to do with threats, and everything to do with the terrible suspicion that Morgana might be right. What if this was all a beautiful dream? What if Darius woke up one day and realized he had made a terrible mistake? What if she was not enough, could never be enough, to hold the attention of a man like him? The doubts that had been lurking at the edges of her mind rushed forward, drowning her in a tide of insecurity. She sank onto a nearby bench, her breath coming in short gasps, panic clawing at her throat. She was being ridiculous, she told herself. Darius had chosen her. He cared for her. But the years of being told she was worthless, of being treated as less than, had left scars that ran deep, and they whispered that happiness like this was not meant for girls like her. "Ariel?" She looked up to find Darius standing at the entrance to the garden, concern etched across his features. He crossed to her in long strides, kneeling before her and taking her hands in his. "What happened? Your scent is distressed, and you're shaking." She wanted to tell him it was nothing, to be strong, to handle this on her own. But something in his eyes, the genuine worry and care, broke through her defenses. "Lady Morgana was here," she whispered. She said things about me not being suitable, about you realizing your mistake, about— Stop, Darius commanded gently, pressing a finger to her lips. Whatever she said is rooted in her own bitterness and disappointment. You are not a mistake, Ariel. You are the first right thing I have done in years. But what if she's right? The words tumbled out before she could stop them. What if this is just novelty, just the appeal of something different? What if one day you wake up and realize you could have had a Luna who knew how to navigate court politics, who could be an asset to your rule, who was actually worthy of standing beside you? Darius's expression hardened, not with anger at her, but at the doubts that had been planted in her mind. Look at me, he said firmly. When she met his eyes, he continued, his voice intense. In 3 days, we will stand before the entire court and before the moon goddess herself, and I will bind myself to you in front of everyone. Not because I am obligated to, not because of political advantage, but because I choose you. Because you are the only woman I have ever met who makes me want to be more than just a king. You make me want to be a man who deserves the gift of your presence in his life. He stood, pulling her up with him, his hands framing her face. I don't care what Lady Morgana says, or any of the other bitter nobles who cannot understand why I would choose substance over superficiality. They don't matter. The only opinion that matters is yours. Do you want this? Do you want me? Ariel searched his face. This powerful man who knelt in gardens and spoke of want and choice and worth. The doubts were still there, whispering their poison, but his sincerity was louder, his conviction stronger. Yes, she breathed. I want this. I want you. I'm just so afraid of losing it. Then we will be afraid together, he said, pressing his forehead to hers. And we will face whatever comes, together. That is what partnership means, Ariel. Sharing the burdens, the fears, the doubts. You don't have to be strong alone anymore. You have me now, and I am not going anywhere. She wrapped her arms around him, breathing in his scent of pine and winter storms, and let herself believe. Just for a moment, she let herself believe that fairy tales could come true, that servant girls could become queens, that love could be strong enough to weather any storm. They stood like that until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and neither of them saw the figure watching from the tower window above, or the cold calculation in eyes that had already begun to plan. The night before the Luna ceremony, Ariel couldn't sleep. She wandered the halls of the castle, her bare feet silent on the cold stone, a robe wrapped around her nightgown. The moon was nearly full, its light streaming through the tall windows, turning everything silver and strange. She found herself in the portrait gallery, surrounded by the painted faces of past Lunas, women who had stood where she would stand tomorrow, who had taken the vows she would take. They all looked so regal, so certain of their place. She wondered if any of them had felt the way she did now. This mixture of hope and terror. This sense of standing on the edge of a cliff and preparing to jump, trusting that someone would catch her before she hit the ground. They would have liked you, I think. She spun around to find an elderly woman standing in the doorway, her silver hair braided down her back, her eyes sharp and knowing. Ariel recognized her as Grandmother Alara, the castle's oldest resident, a distant cousin of the royal line who served as keeper of traditions and histories. I didn't mean to disturb anyone, Ariel said quickly. I couldn't sleep, and I— Come here, child, Alara interrupted, beckoning her closer. Let me look at you properly. Ariel approached hesitantly, unsure what to expect. Alara studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, a small smile playing at her lips. Yes, she said softly. You'll do nicely. I'm sorry? You have the look of my grandmother about you, Alara explained, gesturing to one of the portraits. She was Luna in a different time, before wealth and bloodlines became the only measures of worth. She was a healer, the daughter of an apothecary, chosen by the Alpha King because he saw in her something that all the noble ladies lacked: compassion, wisdom, the ability to see people as they truly were, not as they pretended to be. Ariel looked at the portrait, seeing a woman with gentle eyes and a kind smile, so different from the stern-faced Lunas in the other paintings. What happened to her? She loved deeply and ruled wisely, Alara said. And she taught me that the strength of a Luna is not measured in her bloodline or her wealth, but in her capacity to hold both power and gentleness in her hands, without letting either corrupt the other. You remind me of her, Ariel. You have that same quality, that same light that draws people in and makes them want to be better. Tears pricked Ariel's eyes. I'm so afraid I'll fail, that I won't be what he needs, what the kingdom needs. Of course you're afraid, Alara replied, reaching out to pat her cheek. Only fools approach power without fear. But fear is not weakness, child. Fear is wisdom, reminding you that what you are about to take on matters, that it deserves respect and careful handling. The question is not whether you will be afraid, but whether you will let that fear guide you toward caution and compassion, or let it paralyze you into inaction. She took Ariel's hand, pressing something cool and smooth into her palm. This belonged to my grandmother. I want you to have it, to wear tomorrow, as a reminder that you are not the first Omega to walk this path, and you carry with you the strength of all the women who came before. Ariel looked down to find a delicate silver pendant in her hand, shaped like a crescent moon with a small amber stone at its center. It was simple and beautiful, worn smooth by years of wear. I can't accept this, she protested. It's too precious. It will be more precious worn by someone who understands its meaning than locked in a box gathering dust, Alara said firmly. Take it, child. Wear it tomorrow. And remember that you belong here, in this castle, in this role, beside your king. Anyone who tells you different is speaking from their own pain and limitations, not from truth. Ariel closed her fingers around the pendant, feeling the weight of history and blessing in its cool surface. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for seeing me. I see you, child, Alara replied. And more importantly, so does he. That is all that matters. She turned and left the gallery, her footsteps fading into silence, leaving Ariel alone with the painted lunas and the moon pendant in her hand. For the first time since Darius had chosen her, she felt a spark of certainty kindle in her chest. She might not have been born for this role, might not have trained for it, might not fit the expectations of what a Luna should be. But she had something none of those other candidates possessed. She had Darius's heart, and he had hers, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. She returned to her chambers as dawn began to paint the sky pink and gold, and finally, she slept. The Luna ceremony began at sunset, when the full moon rose over Stormfang Castle like a blessing made visible. The great hall had been transformed into something out of a dream, with white flowers cascading from every surface, candles burning in silver holders, and silk banners embroidered with ancient symbols of blessing and binding hanging from the rafters. The entire court assembled in their finest clothes, their faces a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and calculation. Ariel stood in the preparation chamber, surrounded by handmaidens who fussed over her dress, her hair, her appearance. The gown they had created for her was a masterpiece of ivory silk and delicate lace, fitted to her body like it had been born there, with long sleeves that tapered to points over her hands, and a train that flowed behind her like moonlight made solid. Her red hair had been swept up and woven with white roses, and around her neck she wore Grandmother Alara's pendant, the amber stone warm against her skin. She looked in the mirror and barely recognized herself. The woman staring back looked like someone important, someone who mattered, someone who could stand beside a king. But underneath the beautiful exterior, she was still just Ariel, the orphaned Omega who had spent her life making herself small. "You look beautiful," one of the handmaidens said softly, and there was genuine warmth in her voice. No hint of the mockery Ariel had grown accustomed to. "Truly, my lady." Like the moon goddess herself. "It's time," another announced, and Ariel's heart kicked into a gallop. This was it. The moment everything changed, irrevocably and forever. She could still walk away, could tell them this was all a mistake, could return to her simple life in the shadows. But even as the thought formed, she dismissed it. She didn't want safety anymore. She wanted this terrifying, beautiful leap into the unknown. She wanted Darius. The doors opened, and the processional music began. Ariel stepped into the corridor, and her handmaidens fell into formation around her, creating a living barrier between her and the world. They moved through the castle, and she was vaguely aware of servants stopping to stare, of whispers following in her wake. But all of it seemed distant, unreal, like she was watching it happen to someone else. Then they reached the entrance to the great hall, and the doors swung open, and everything snapped into sharp, painful focus. Hundreds of faces turned toward her, hundreds of eyes judging, assessing, questioning. The aisle stretched before her like an impossible distance, and at the end of it, standing before the dais where the high priestess waited, was Darius. He wore ceremonial robes of deep blue and silver, his white hair gleaming in the candlelight, and when their eyes met across that vast space, everything else disappeared. There was only him, only the way he looked at her like she was the answer to every prayer he had never known how to speak. He extended his hand, and she began to walk. Each step felt both too fast and too slow. She was aware of the whispers, of the way some nobles barely hid their disdain, of the tension thrumming through the air. But she kept her eyes on Darius, on the man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had chosen her when he could have had anyone. He was her North Star, her anchor, and she walked toward him with growing certainty. When she reached the dais, he took her hand, his touch warm and solid and real. "You look like a dream," he murmured, for her ears alone. "Like something I was afraid to want, for fear it would disappear." "I'm real," she whispered back. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The high priestess began the ceremony, her voice rich and resonant, speaking words that had been spoken for centuries, binding alphas and their chosen mates in bonds that transcended law and politics. She talked about partnership and balance, about strength tempered with compassion, about the sacred duty of leadership. Ariel barely heard most of it, too focused on Darius's hand in hers, on the steady rhythm of his breathing, on the way his thumb traced small circles on her palm. Then came the vows, the promises they would make before the gathered court and the moon goddess herself. Darius went first, his voice clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the hall. "I, Darius Stormfang, Alpha King of these lands, take you, Ariel, as my Luna, my partner, my equal in all things. I vow to honor you, to protect you, to stand beside you in times of peace and war, joy and sorrow. I vow to see you, always, as the extraordinary woman you are, and to spend my life ensuring you never doubt your worth again. I give you my heart, my loyalty, and my love, for as long as the moon rises and the stars shine." His words hung in the air like a spell, and Ariel felt her throat close with emotion. Then it was her turn, and she took a shaking breath, gathering her courage. "I, Ariel, daughter of none but child of the moon, take you, Darius Stormfang, as my alpha, my partner, my anchor in the storm. I vow to stand beside you when the weight of the crown grows heavy, to be your peace when the world demands only your strength. I vow to love you not for what you can give me, but for who you are beneath all the armor and obligation. I give you my heart, my loyalty, and my trust, for as long as I draw breath." Tears streaked down her cheeks as she spoke, and she saw his eyes glisten in response. The high priestess bound their hands together with a silver cord, speaking the final blessing. And then Darius pulled her close and kissed her, deep and tender and claiming, in front of the entire court. Around them, the assembly erupted in applause, some genuine, some politely forced. But none of it mattered because in that moment, there was only the two of them, only this perfect, impossible reality they had created together. The feast that followed was a blur of faces and congratulations, of music and dancing, of rich food and expensive wine. Ariel moved through it in a daze, Darius's hand always at her back, his presence a constant reassurance. She met nobles and diplomats, smiled and nodded and tried to remember names and titles, playing the role she had been thrust into with more grace than she knew she possessed. But as the night wore on, she felt a prickling at the back of her neck, a sense of being watched with more than casual interest. She glanced around the hall and caught sight of Lady Morgana standing near one of the columns, her expression cold and calculating, her gaze fixed on Ariel with such intensity that it sent a chill down her spine. "Don't let her get to you," Darius murmured, noticing the direction of her gaze. "She has no power over us, over what we have." "I know," Ariel replied. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that beneath the celebration and music, danger lurked like a predator in tall grass. The feeling proved prophetic. Just as the moon reached its zenith, just as the high priestess prepared to offer the final blessing of the ceremony, a commotion erupted near the entrance to the hall. Guards rushed forward, and the crowd parted to reveal a figure stumbling into the candlelight, bloodied and beaten, barely able to stand. It was Marcus, one of Darius's most trusted scouts, and he looked like he had ridden through hell to deliver his message. He collapsed at the foot of the dais, gasping for breath, and Darius was beside him in an instant. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice sharp with concern and command. "Your Majesty," Marcus gasped, blood flecking his lips. "Attack! The southern border. Raiders from the Shadowland territories. They came at sunset, hundreds of them, overwhelming our defenses. The garrison is holding, but barely. They need reinforcements immediately, or they'll be overrun by morning." A collective gasp ran through the hall. The Shadowlands had been quiet for years, their threat considered neutralized. For them to attack now, on this night, was either terrible timing or calculated strategy. Darius's face went hard as stone, his eyes calculating, already running through tactical considerations and strategic responses. "How many?" he asked curtly. "At least 500, maybe more. They're organized, well-armed. This isn't a raid, Your Majesty. This is an invasion." Darius stood slowly, and Ariel could see the transformation happen in real time. The man who had stood beside her moments ago, soft with love and promise, disappeared, replaced by the Alpha King, the warrior, the commander who had built his reputation on the battlefield. It was like watching someone put on armor made of ice and iron. "Summon the generals," he commanded, his voice carrying through the suddenly silent hall. "Every available soldier is to be ready to march within the hour. We ride for the southern border before dawn." He turned to Ariel, and for just a moment, she saw conflict in his eyes, the war between duty and desire, between the king he had to be and the man he wanted to be. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, and she heard the genuine anguish in his voice. "I have to go. The kingdom needs—" "I know," she interrupted, reaching up to touch his face. "I understand. Go. Do what you must. I'll be here when you return. I don't want to leave you. Not now. Not tonight of all nights." "Then come back to me," she said fiercely, gripping his hands. "Come back safe and whole, and we'll have all the time in the world." He kissed her then, hard and desperate, a kiss that tasted of promises and goodbye. When he pulled away, his eyes were fierce. "I will return," he vowed. "No matter what happens, I will come back to you." Then he was gone, striding from the hall with his generals in tow, already issuing orders, already transforming into the weapon his father had shaped him to be. The celebration dissolved into chaos, nobles rushing to leave, servants scrambling to prepare supplies, the whole castle mobilizing for war. Ariel stood alone on the dais, still wearing her Luna gown, still crowned with flowers, and felt the weight of reality crash down on her shoulders. This was what it meant to be Luna, not just ceremonies and celebrations, but this, the constant awareness that duty could tear your world apart at any moment, that the man you loved belonged first to the kingdom, and only secondarily to you. She watched from the castle ramparts as Darius led his army south, a river of torches flowing into the darkness, and she prayed to the moon goddess that he would return, that their story wouldn't end before it had truly begun. Behind her, she heard footsteps and turned to find Lady Morgana standing in the shadows, a small smile playing at her lips. "Such a shame," Morgana said softly, her voice carrying a note of false sympathy. "Your wedding night interrupted by war. But I suppose that's the risk of marrying a king. They belong to everyone, and sometimes they don't come home at all." Ariel felt rage kindle in her chest, hot and bright. "He will come home," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear churning in her gut. "And when he does, I will still be here, still his Luna, still the woman he chose. Will you?" Morgana's smile faltered, and for just a moment, Ariel saw something dark and dangerous flash across her face. Then she schooled her features back to polite neutrality. "Of course," she said smoothly. "We will all be here, waiting to see if the little Omega can hold together a kingdom while her king is away. That should be quite the spectacle." She swept away, leaving Ariel alone on the ramparts with the wind and the moon, and a fear that felt like ice in her veins. But underneath the fear, something else stirred. Determination. Strength. The realization that she could either crumble under the pressure, or she could rise to meet it. She could prove every doubt wrong, every whispered criticism false. She could be the Luna this kingdom needed, not just the woman Darius loved. She would not fail. Not him, not herself, not the kingdom that now looked to her for strength. She was Ariel, daughter of no one and everyone, chosen by the moon and by an alpha king who had seen her worth when the world was blind. And she would not break. The days that followed were the longest of Ariel's life. Word came sporadically from the front, fragments of news that painted a picture of brutal fighting and heavy casualties. The Shadowland forces were better organized than anyone had anticipated, led by a commander who seemed to know exactly where to strike, how to maximize damage. Darius and his army were holding the line, but barely, and each messenger that arrived brought news that made Ariel's heart clench with fear, but she could not afford to show that fear. As Luna, the court looked to her for stability, for assurance that everything would be well. She found herself thrust into a role she had never trained for, attending council meetings, making decisions about resource allocation, managing the castle and the nobles who remained behind. It was terrifying and exhausting, and she stumbled more often than she succeeded. But slowly, something shifted. The servants who had watched her with skepticism began to warm to her, seeing how hard she worked, how she never asked anyone to do something she wouldn't do herself. She spent time in the kitchens, helping prepare supplies for the soldiers. She visited the healer's hall, sitting with wounded men who had been sent back from the front, listening to their stories, offering comfort. And gradually, grudgingly, even some of the nobles began to see her differently. Not as an interloper or a mistake, but as someone who genuinely cared, who was trying her best despite overwhelming odds. Grandmother Alara became her advisor and ally, teaching her the intricate politics of court, helping her navigate the treacherous waters of noble rivalries and alliances. "You're doing well," Alara told her one evening, as they reviewed reports from the border. better than many Lunas before you who had years of training. You have something they lacked: heart. The ability to connect with people, not as pawns or problems to be managed. I feel like I'm drowning, Ariel admitted. Every day there's something new. Some crisis or decision I don't know how to handle. And all I can think about is whether Darius is safe, whether he'll come home, whether I'll have the chance to tell him that I understand now, truly understand what it means to be Luna. He knows, Ilara assured her. And when he returns, he will be so proud of what you've accomplished. But doubt continued to gnaw at Ariel. On the 14th day after Darius had left, she was in the council chamber reviewing supply manifests when Lady Morgana appeared in the doorway, her face arranged in an expression of false concern. "My Lady Luna," she said, her voice dripping with honey. "I wondered if I might have a word in private." Ariel's instincts screamed danger, but she was Luna now, and she couldn't refuse to speak with a member of the court without good reason. "Of course," she replied, dismissing the servants. When they were alone, she turned to Morgana. "What can I do for you, Lady Morgana?" Morgana moved closer, her eyes glittering with something cold and calculating. "I wanted to offer my condolences," she said softly. "On your impending loss." Ariel's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, haven't you heard? A messenger arrived just an hour ago with news from the front. The Shadowland forces broke through the line. There was a terrible battle, many casualties. They say the Alpha King fought bravely, but even kings can fall when outnumbered." "You're lying," Ariel said, but her voice shook. "If something had happened to Darius, I would have been told immediately." "Would you?" Morgana asked, tilting her head. "Or would the council try to keep it quiet, to prevent panic, to give themselves time to figure out the succession before announcing that our dear king has fallen?" "Get out," Ariel said, her voice low and dangerous. "Get out now, before I have you thrown out." Morgana smiled, a predator's smile. "As you wish, my lady. But you might want to ask yourself why no one has briefed you on the latest news, why the castle is so quiet today. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words." She left, and Ariel stood frozen, fear and fury warring in her chest. Was it true? Had something happened to Darius? She rushed to the council chambers demanding to see the latest reports, and found them evasive, hesitant. There had been a major battle, yes. Casualties, yes. But the Alpha King was alive, they assured her. Wounded perhaps, but alive. The perhaps nearly broke her. She locked herself in her chambers and allowed herself one moment of absolute terror, of imagining a world without him in it, before pulling herself together. She was Luna. She could not fall apart. Not now. Not when the kingdom needed her to be strong. So she dried her tears, straightened her shoulders, and went back to work, pushing the fear down deep where it couldn't touch her. But that night, she dreamed of white hair stained red with blood, of gray eyes closing for the last time, and she woke screaming his name. On the 20th day, everything changed. Ariel was in the Great Hall, mediating a dispute between two noble houses, when a commotion arose at the entrance. She looked up to see guards rushing in, their faces bright with relief and excitement. "My Lady Luna," one of them called. "They're coming. The army is returning. They're less than an hour away." The hall erupted in cheers and celebration. Ariel felt her heart leap into her throat, hope and terror tangling together. He was coming home. Darius was coming home. But in what condition? How badly was he wounded? Would he even remember her? Remember them, after weeks of war and bloodshed? She rushed to the ramparts, along with what seemed like half the castle, and waited. The minutes stretched like hours, each one an eternity. And then, in the distance, she saw them. Banners flying, armor glinting in the afternoon sun, the army of Stormfang Castle returning victorious. And at the front, riding a massive black horse, white hair bright against the sky, was Darius. Ariel felt tears stream down her face. He was alive. He was whole. He was coming home to her. She didn't remember descending the stairs, didn't remember running through the courtyard, but suddenly she was there as he dismounted, and then she was in his arms, and nothing else mattered. He held her so tightly she could barely breathe, his face buried in her hair, his body shaking with emotion. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm home. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm so sorry." "You're alive," she sobbed against his chest. "That's all that matters. You came back to me." They stood like that for a long time, oblivious to the cheering crowd, to the celebration erupting around them. Finally, Darius pulled back enough to look at her, and she saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I heard what you did," he said softly, "while I was gone. How you held the kingdom together, how you won over the court, how you proved every doubt wrong. I am so proud of you, Ariel. So incredibly proud." "I just did what needed to be done," she replied, touching his face, reassuring herself that he was real, that he was truly here. "The same as you." "No," he said firmly. "You did so much more. You became exactly what I knew you could be, what you always were. Underneath all the fear and doubt, you became Luna, not just in title, but in truth." They walked into the castle together, his arm around her waist, and for the first time since the choosing, Ariel felt like she truly belonged. Not because she had been chosen, but because she had earned it, had proven herself capable and strong and worthy. The whispers had not stopped entirely, but they had changed. Now when people spoke of the Luna, there was respect in their voices, admiration even. That evening, there was a feast to celebrate the army's return and their victory. Darius stood before the assembled court and told them of the battle, of how they had pushed back the Shadowland forces and secured a treaty that would ensure peace for years to come. And then he did something unexpected. He called Ariel to stand beside him, and he told them about her too, about how she had led in his absence, how she had proven herself a true Luna in every way that mattered. "I chose her not knowing how perfect that choice would prove to be," he said, his voice carrying through the hall. "I chose her because my heart recognized something my mind could not yet comprehend, that she was exactly what I needed, what this kingdom needed. Someone who leads with compassion as well as strength, who sees people as they are and brings out the best in them. I am honored to call her my Luna, my partner, my love." The applause that followed was thunderous and genuine. Even Lady Morgana, standing in the shadows, could not hide her defeat. She had tried to break them, to prove them wrong, and she had failed. What Darius and Ariel had built together was stronger than doubt, stronger than politics, stronger than anyone's expectations. Late that night, when the celebration had finally died down, Darius and Ariel retreated to their chambers. He drew her into his arms, and they stood together by the window, looking out over the kingdom that was now truly theirs. "I was so afraid," she admitted softly. "When you were gone, when I thought I might have lost you before we even had a chance to truly begin, it made me realize how precious this is, what we have, how rare it is to find someone who sees you completely and loves you anyway. You don't have to be afraid anymore," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We've weathered the worst storm. Everything else will be easier in comparison." "Do you really believe that?" "I believe that as long as we face it together, we can weather anything," he replied. "That's what we promised each other, remember? To stand together through joy and sorrow, peace and war. We've proven we can do it. Now we get to discover what comes next." She turned in his arms, looking up at him with eyes full of love and trust. "What comes next?" is us building a life together, a real life, not just surviving crisis after crisis, but actually living, having lazy mornings and quiet evenings, making memories that aren't tinged with fear or duty, just being together, being happy. That sounds perfect, he said, and kissed her, slow and deep and full of promise. That sounds like exactly what I want. And for the first time in their lives, both of them believed in happy endings. Not because everything was perfect, or because they wouldn't face challenges ahead, but because they had found something real and true and worth fighting for. They had found each other. The seasons turned, winter giving way to spring, giving way to summer, and Stormfang Castle settled into a new rhythm under the guidance of its Alpha King and his Luna. Ariel transformed the court in small but meaningful ways, instituting programs to help orphans like she had been, creating opportunities for Omegas to rise above their station through merit rather than birth. She became beloved by the common people, who saw in her a champion for those who had no voice. And Darius, who had spent so many years locked away behind walls of duty and obligation, learned what it meant to truly live. With Ariel at his side, he rediscovered joy, laughter, the simple pleasure of waking up beside someone who loved him not for his power or position, but for the man he was beneath the crown. They had their struggles, their disagreements, their moments of doubt, but they faced them together with honesty and commitment, and each challenge overcome only made their bond stronger. The court watched in amazement as their king, once so cold and distant, became someone capable of warmth and tenderness, and they understood finally what he had seen in the servant girl with red hair and amber eyes. She had saved him. Not from enemies or danger, but from a life devoid of meaning and connection. She had taken a man who had forgotten how to feel and taught him that vulnerability was not weakness, that love was not a distraction, but the very thing that gave power its purpose. A year after the choosing, on the anniversary of the Luna ceremony, they renewed their vows in a quiet ceremony attended only by those closest to them. This time, there were no doubts, no fears, no questions about whether they belonged together. There was only certainty, only the deep knowledge that they had found their other half, their perfect complement, their home. As they stood together on the ramparts that night, watching the full moon rise over their kingdom, Darius pulled Ariel close and whispered in her ear. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" "For being in that alcove," he replied. "For being brave enough to hope when everything in your life had taught you not to. For choosing me when you could have refused, when any sane person would have run from the complications and challenges. For loving me when I didn't know how to love myself." Ariel turned to face him, her eyes shining with tears and moonlight. "You saved me too," she said. "You saw me when I was invisible. You chose me when I had been taught I would never be chosen. You made me believe that I was worth loving, that I deserved happiness, that my story didn't have to end in shadows." "Our story is just beginning," Darius said, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips, "and I cannot wait to see where it leads." They stood together as the moon traced its path across the sky. Two souls who had found each other against all odds, against all expectations. The servant girl and the Alpha King, the Omega and the ruler, bound together by something stronger than fate, more powerful than destiny. Bound together by choice, by recognition, by a love that had transformed them both into something greater than they could have ever been alone. And in the castle below them, in the kingdom they ruled together, life went on. People fell in love and raised families, built businesses and dreamed dreams. The seasons turned and the years passed, and through it all, Darius and Ariel remained constants, beacons of hope and proof that sometimes the most unlikely stories turned out to be the truest. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not that a king had chosen a servant, but that two lonely souls had found each other in a crowded room and decided that what they built together was worth more than anything they could have built alone. That was the real fairy tale, the real magic, not in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in the quiet decision to see each other, to choose each other, to love each other through everything life could throw their way. Years later, when their story was told around fires and in bedtime tales, people would focus on the choosing, on the drama and the ceremony, on the servant girl who became Luna. But those who had been there, who had watched their love grow and deepen and mature, knew the truth. The choosing was just the beginning. The real story was everything that came after. All the days and nights they spent building a life together, creating a legacy of compassion and strength, proving that love, real love, was not about grand moments, but about showing up, day after day, choosing each other over and over again. And when the moon rose full and bright over Stormfang Castle, people would look up and remember. Remember the night an Alpha King looked past 256 perfect candidates and chose instead the woman who knelt in shadows and made torn things whole. Remember that sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is not strength or wealth or status, but the courage to see past all of that and recognize the one soul that matches your own. Darius and Ariel lived long and ruled wisely, their love a foundation upon which an entire kingdom built its hopes. And when they finally passed, decades later, on the same night within hours of each other, the kingdom mourned not just the loss of a king and his Luna, but the end of a story that had reminded them all what truly mattered. But their legacy lived on. In the programs Ariel had created, in the compassionate leadership Darius had modeled, in the children they had raised, and the grandchildren who carried their names and their values forward. And most of all, in the story itself, told and retold, a reminder that love could bridge any gap, overcome any obstacle, transform any life. The servant girl and the Alpha King, the Omega and the ruler. Ariel and Darius, two souls who found each other when they needed it most and built something beautiful from the ashes of their loneliness. That was the real magic. That was the true fairy tale. Not in the choosing, but in everything that came after. In the life they built together, the love they shared, the legacy they left behind. And on quiet nights, when the moon is full and the world is still, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear it. The echo of their love, still resonating through the stones of Stormfang Castle, a reminder that sometimes the most unlikely stories turn out to be the most true. Sometimes, the poor Omega is exactly who the Alpha King needs. Sometimes, love is enough. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this beautiful love story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.